done for. Everyone get out.
Greetings sailors, welcome back to World of Warships, and I bring you a preliminary preview of the German cruisers, much as I did with the Russian destroyers. And I'd actually planned with the Russian destroyers to get all the gameplay videos out first, but actually I've decided to at least get the German cruiser preview up. The port section, the bit where I talk about the look and feel of the line. And that's what this is going to be. It is basically preliminary thoughts. It's definitely not my final say on the matter. It's just my initial impressions. And honestly, they're not very good. If you take anything else about my thoughts away from this, it's that this entire line was just disappointing, really. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this, but before I get into any real specifics, I want to say that the flavour of this line, I kind of finally figured out what it's meant to be, but it took a while. And with the Russian destroyers, it also took a while because the eye-catching figure of those very short torpedo ranges is kind of distracting. You see that and you think, huh, these aren't very good, and then you figure out what they're actually supposed to do. And actually, the line, at least the tier 9 and the 10, in fact, potentially from tier 5 and up, they might actually be on the end of overpowered, but I think that's more time will tell. We'll see. But they might be. I have a sneaking suspicion that we might encounter balance problems with the Russian destroyers. These, however, are, I mean, if they overdid it with the Russian destroyers, potentially, they most certainly seem to have underdone it with the German cruisers. And I think what they're supposed to be are battleship escorts. I'm not 100% certain, but it kind of feels that way. These are pretty much pure support vessels. They're not really vessels where you can take initiative very well because of the characteristics of them. I actually on Twitter likened the entire line to the Churchill gun carrier. And you might be having an initial kind of sinking feeling about, oh my god, they're that bad. Well, I mean something quite specific by that. The Churchill gun carrier has a very good gun on a very poor chassis, and its mobility alone means that there is a very kind of narrow range of circumstances within a game of World of Tanks where it can truly be effective. Like, you need the cards to line up just right, and that's kind of what I mean with these. It's a very, very kind of narrow range of comfort almost, of a place on the battlefield or on the oceans in this particular, you know, analogy saying whatever, where these things really seem to work, and even then they don't really work very well at what I think it is that they're meant to be doing. So I might be wrong about that. I might be reading that wrong, but it was really only when I sat down and looked at the stats that I kind of went, is this what they're supposed to be? Because playing through them, I didn't get that at all. I really didn't. I want to, at this point, thank a WoW's forum user by the name of Exustio, I think it's Exustio, who basically has done a very much more complete job of what I did with the Russian DDs, where I plugged a bunch of numbers into a spreadsheet and used that to glean some information. And basically they have done exactly the same thing, except it's with every ship in the game. In fact, every ship that you can see in the client, because there's a rather nice mod, if you don't know, and it's actually available through Aslane's World of Warships mod pack, that basically lets you see everything in the client file. So I can go and say, hey look, there's the premium Polish destroyer that they announced, and you know, I can look at some of the stuff that's in the files for the Soviets, and I can see the Warspite all there on its own, and I can see the Germans have got a Bismarck that looks like it might be a premium. So I don't know, these numbers might change, but that's kind of like, you can at least get a sneaky preview of some of these things, and you can check for yourself. But yeah, I mean, the numbers on the ships at the moment, the next patch is not that far off, so they probably won't change drastically in that time, but I hope they will over a longer time frame, because at the moment, as I said, I just don't think they're very good. Now, what made me think about the possible role of these was the fact that from tier 6 upwards, and it is only from tier 6 upwards, you get a much better range than contemporaries, except it's not that much better. It's usually less than a 2 kilometer advantage over your same tiered cruisers, and I'm trying to think actually what tier for tier might be the best. It's probably the tier 10, which has, let's see, that's got 2 kilometers over the Des Moines. Excuse my voice going a bit there, but yeah, otherwise, I mean, that seems to be it. I mean, they're all reasonably fast, but no faster than their contemporaries. Again, from, I think it's tier 6, or it might be tier 5 actually. I'm just scrolling to have a look. I think it is, no, it is tier 7, in fact. Is it? No, it's tier 8. I take it back. At tier 8, from tier 8 upwards, you also get more health. But it's only from tier 8. You know, that's once you've really hit the high tiers. I thought it was lower than that, but no, I was misremembering. So you have more health from tiers 8 to 10, and from tiers 6 to 10 you have more range. Now the way you pay for that is your maneuverability. Now these are not slow particularly, but they all have the worst rudder shift times, and that can really make a big difference when you're trying to evade an enemy spread of torpedoes. So these react badly to being near enemy destroyers, but most crucially, you're trading away a lot of firepower. Now, it's a couple of things in terms of the firepower. I mean, you've got the range, okay, and there might be hidden things like shell penetration that I can't look up. And I will say the lower tiers seem to have very slow traveling shells, but I think from either tier 6 or tier 7 it does pick up a lot, so that it might be that these, again at these top tiers, it might be that you have a shell speed advantage, because I happen to know for a fact that the Tirpitz has got fairly fast shells. But the lack of punch in these guns, even for cruiser guns, tier for tier, and it's true across every single tier, but maybe not the tier 1 actually, but at least from tier 2 to tier 10, you have less AP damage, you have less HE damage, and you have, in some cases, much less chance to set ships on fire with the HE. So you might be thinking, well, do they fire faster to make up for this? No, mostly no. And in those cases where sometimes they fire faster than the Japanese cruisers, and in fact I think that might be generally true. And you're not paying too much cost in terms of the turret traverse times, which again they kind of compare to the Japanese cruisers in that way. But the Japanese cruisers have much harder hitting guns, even though they're exactly the same caliber for the most part. For the Russians, not for the Russians, for the Americans, you don't get the 203 mils, the 8, is it 8 inches? Yes, the 8 inches until I think it's tier 7. For the Japanese, of course, it's tier 5, and for these it is, well, technically it's tier 8. Your first 8-inch plus guns are on the tier 7, but they're a funny caliber. They're 210 millimeters, so they're 8 point something inches. So I don't know. The tier 7 is a bit of a funny one, anyway. But yeah, I mean, tier for tier, I really felt that the lack of ability to set people on fire, especially because with the higher tier cruisers, you can't effectively consistently do damage against battleships with AP shells. But you're forced to resort to AP shells on these, and you're helped out a lot by the fact that across the line you have a very high shell arc, and actually at the lower tiers especially, the AP was definitely more effective against battleships than other cruisers because they're a fatter target, and you have that very high arc, which means you can get those deck pens, because the low to mid tier battleships don't tend to have great deck armor. So they're reasonably effective. They kind of make up for less AP damage and less ability to set things on fire by the fact that you can get those penetrating AP hits. But it makes hitting cruisers harder because they're a narrower target, and I was having a lot of an easier time of it against battleships than I was against cruisers. So these aren't really cruisers, at least up to the mid tiers, that are particularly great at firing at other cruisers, and that's still kind of true at the high tiers as well, because as the ranges get longer, as the dispersion increases, as the ranges get longer, the spread of course widens a bit. And yeah, I was getting a lot of very low damage shots. I'd be having battles where I'd have 60 or 70 hits, and if I'm lucky 25,000 damage between both shell types. And it's a real, like, knowing what shell to use is just because you can take the risk, and occasionally I'd get Citadel hits, although the Citadels with the AP on this line generally don't do a lot. They're not worth that much because they have the lowest AP damage values tier for tier, lowest HE value damage values tier for tier. Yeah, it ended up being just overpen after, or spalling damage, not even overpen, spalling damage after spalling damage, and I'd have 1,000 damage for every 5 hits kind of thing, and it was just frustrating. So you think, okay, no, try the HE, and I did that in some games. I shot a lot of HE, but then that decreased fire chance really counts against you, as well as the decreased HE damage. Because when I talk about, let's say, the tier 7, okay, the Pensacola has 2,800 HE shell damage, the York has 2,300. Now this is a penning HE shell hit, so of course you're never going to get that even with a Pensacola for the most part, but when it explodes it does a certain amount of damage, and of course proportionally you're doing less with the York, because the actual shell damage is worth less. But you add to that the fact that the Pensacola has 14% chance of fire and the York has 12. It doesn't sound that big of a difference. On some tiers, the Americans and the Germans are not that far apart. It's a couple of percentage points. But then you look at the rate of fire and you think, well, Or you look at the dispersion and you think, So actually, tier for tier, the York was a bad example because that actually has a slightly better rate of fire than the Pensacola, and the Pensacola is not regarded as a very good ship. So if I go to the tier 6, the Cleveland, okay, that's probably a better example. 12% chance of fire on the Cleveland with 7.5 rounds a minute, and the Nuremberg does actually have a faster rate of fire, but it's only 8% rounds per minute, and the difference between the HE shells is quite considerable. There's 500 damage difference. So, yeah, it's more pronounced at the higher tiers than the lower tiers, but even the lower tiers, the tier 2 and the tier 3, which are basically St. Louis style HE spammers, you have 105mm guns while everyone else has 152mm guns, and you have to put out a lot of shots, but you have the rate of fire to do it, and so the lower chances don't matter so much. So, honestly, I mean, up to like tier 5, tier 6, it doesn't matter that much. You don't really have the extra range, you do less damage, but you can get more of those penning deck hits against battleships. Although, I have to say, against battleships, those penning hits are worth less XP. And the way this game works is, it's percentages that matter when you're doing damage to people. So that's why destroyers are particularly valuable, because they don't have a lot of health. It's easy to take off a high percentage of their damage with relatively few hits. Whereas a Yamato, for instance, would not actually be worth as much XP in terms of, you know, the same number of hits versus a destroyer, because you're taking off a much smaller percentage of their total health pool. So at the higher tiers, it really hurts. It really does. And I mean, the Hindenburg, the extra range is okay. I mean, it actually, if you set it up, it can actually be the best AA cruiser at tier 10. I'm just scrolling down to look at the values now, and he's actually very helpfully included DPS figures. It has a potential DPS of 339 versus 192, but the American Des Moines has much longer ranged guns. It's got more of the longer ranged guns, so even though it's 192, they'll start engaging faster. In fact, the tier 10 Japanese cruiser has a raw DPS figure that's better than the Des Moines, but again, shorter ranged guns, so lots and lots of short ranged guns. It's not that good, but it's still, you know, it's more than capable of defending itself and any other ships that are in the immediate vicinity, but they have to be pretty close. So the tier 9 and 10 you can kind of set up that way, and the extra equipment slots mean that you can customize it a bit. You can either concentrate on getting more range, and the base range is pretty good to begin with, but you can extend it to almost battleship ranges basically, and at that point, okay, you've got the range, but you've also got the lowest rate of fire, or actually no, not quite. The Zhao has the lowest rate of fire, but it also has a lot more damage with the shells that it can hit. So it's just, I don't know. I just found the whole line I mean, the guns alone with the high arc take some getting used to, and as I've said, they definitely are a lot easier to make hits on battleships, and I'm going to guess, you know, other German cruisers as well, because these are not small ships. They do tier for tier have the worst detection ranges, I think, both from the air and from the surface. But that doesn't matter so much unless you're unfortunate enough to be the first one spotted, which you really don't want to happen, because none of these are particularly well armoured. Some of them have more armour than their contemporaries, but I can't exactly look up the exact armour model. But on the whole, not really. It doesn't feel like it. I mean, the Hindenburg has less armour than the Des Moines. The Des Moines is actually a more armoured ship than this is. Although in areas it maybe has a bit more armour, but overall it seems like it has less. So that's the flavour. They're kind of long range, except only at the top tiers, and they kind of have more hit points, except only at the very top tiers, and they consistently do less damage, and it's harder to hit longer ranged cruisers and destroyers, and you only get flat arcs at very close ranges, and getting citadels against other cruisers definitely a lot easier than the Japanese ships, and those citadels are worth more in the Japanese ships. So I don't know what they're supposed to be good at, is the thing. And I've played them a bunch. I've actually played them more than the Japanese destroyers, and I still don't know what they're supposed to be good at. I mean, they've got torpedoes, I suppose, but like the Tirpitz, they're 6-kilometer torpedoes. They're pretty much just self-defense. So, yeah, I don't know. I haven't had a good time in these. And bear in mind, as I've said, this is all just my preliminary thoughts, but they are distinctly underwhelming. It feels like you trade way too much firepower for the ability to get longer ranged shots at the top tiers. Like, you don't even have that trade at the lower mid tiers, but they don't feel quite so bad because you've got the softer battleships to shoot at those tiers, whereas at the higher tiers things generally have more deck armor. There's probably exceptions. I don't have the deck armor of every single battleship memorized, but yeah, it doesn't feel like a good trade. So unlike the Soviet DDs where I went through kind of into a bit more detail for each ship, I'm not really going to. I think I'm just going to wrap this up here because there's not much more to say. They're just underwhelming. They don't feel particularly good. And other people may disagree with me. Other people may really like what they can do, but what they can do is just distinctly outclassed for the most part by the other ships that are around. So yeah, I mean, the destroyers, the Russian destroyers have a fairly ultra-specific playstyle, and these kind of do as well, except with the destroyers it's a fun one, and this one, not really. It's sitting next to your battleships and firing at longer ranges, and if your battleship drivers kind of suck, like the CGC, you're kind of a bit stuffed by your own team, because you can't really go off on your own independent initiative and do a whole lot because you just can't take the punishment. So it's like the Churchill gun carrier in that way as well. It's very, very sensitive to how good your team is. And people don't want that. People want ships where they can at least have a reasonable chance of making their own impact. And that is probably a bit harder to do in Warships in terms of getting that balance. Even though it's smaller teams, just the nature of the game means that you are more dependent on the team as a whole. But the Russian destroyers do that far, far better, maybe a little bit too well even, in comparison to these. And these, just compared to the other cruisers, I'm just not feeling it. I'm just not. But as I said, very early thoughts. So, you can put your own thoughts in the description below. I will have a link to Excuzio's, I've probably said it wrong there, Exustio, there we go. Why did you have to have such a complicated name? God damn it. I will put a link to his spreadsheet in, and you can look at it. It's a very handy resource. There's no kind of online databases like TanksGG or applications like Tank Inspector for Warships yet, but you know, maybe there will be with time. But for now, basically Excel online spreadsheets is as good as it gets. But it's a very useful resource, and once again, thank you for that guy whose name I'm not going to say again for making it available for everybody. So yeah, you can leave any thoughts and comments below. You can hit the like button or dislike button, as the case may be. Maybe you're a big fan of these, I don't know. You can subscribe to my channel, and as always, stay tuned for more.